I just wanted to say that this, like, I do think the transcripts represent a very subtle resource, and Holmes in her final report had to do a massive TikTok.
Yeah.
And blow by blow, and she was like, she focused on what Milan Kundera, the Czech novelist, calls the second-rate question, which is who knew what when, the knowledge question. And what we know is the knowledge question, if you focus on it, is not going to give us the change. Because we've got to talk about the dynamics we're going to talk about now.
Welcome to the Westminster tradition, where we are unpacking lessons for the public service, starting with the Robodebt Royal Commission. My name is Alison Lloyd-Wright, and joining me today on Kaurna land is my fellow South Australian public servant, Caroline Crozer-Barlow.
Hello, Alison.
And recovering public servant, Danielle Elston.
Hello, Alison.
So, Caroline, you spent a couple of hours talking with Dr Darren O'Donovan, Senior Lecturer at La Trobe Law School, and we've published that as a bonus episode. But it is long. So you promised to bring it to me and Danielle in bite-sized chunks. And today we're going to talk about Dr O'Donovan's thoughts on taking responsibility. The whole process of making people responsible, accountability for Robodebt is still underway with the sealed section. The most hilarious part of the Royal Commission. It's like it's a Dolly magazine from 1993.
Only the girls from, 1980 to 1999. I suspect that's the funniest part.
So, look, obviously, we don't know the contents of that section, and possible disciplinary proceedings are slowly playing out. But what is striking in the Royal Commission is that on the stand, especially as we were watching it live, we saw a real avoidance of responsibility for the program from everyone.
Yeah.
But before we keep going, now I haven't quite listened to the whole interview, mainly because it's actually really gripping, and I often tune out listening to podcasts, which I'm sure our listeners never, ever do. And so I've stopped a number of times to go back to it. What I have picked up so far is that it really focuses on the victim. So Darren's talking about what we need to think about in relation to the citizens of Australia.
Yeah.
And he kind of gently nudges you to ensure that Robodebt's legacy isn't something that we've talked about before, which is that kind of self-licking ice cream cone of satisfied lesson learning. Mm-hmm. And we've talked about that in the podcast before, that how do you learn without the learning becoming kind of performative, I suppose.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
How do you cover that?
It's a really good point, and I do really encourage everyone to have a listen so that you can hear him kind of relay his thinking on that more acutely. And I guess I wanted us to just have a little moment to pause on it, because it does sit a bit awkwardly for us in this room. Like in this pod, we're doing a particular thing that's really bounded by the Public Sector Code of Ethics, and shout out to everyone who loves our disclaimer at the end. I get a lot of feedback about that. But it does act as a constraint, because we're taking this latitude to kind of have a public conversation about improving the public sector and improving practice. And deliberately that therefore means we have to avoid the kind of much more political and contested terrain of policy, like what is good, because of course we work for governments of all different stripes and we need to retain,
and still do, and
yeah, exactly. So I really encourage you to have a listen to Darren on this, because he offers some really excellent and gripping thoughts both about victims and about what our social security policy story is in this country. But that's not for today.
That does just highlight again how important it is to have non-public servants talking about being interested in and poking the public service, though. Like, there are limitations, and they're for a good reason, and so I have no issue at all with them. And it creates a bit of a gap that people like Darren and other interested parties can fill by kind of poking and prodding and providing that kind of advice, or reflection is probably the better word, reflecting the practice back completely unconstrained.
Yeah, absolutely. So really go have a listen. Look, anyway, one of the things that Darren and I did talk a lot about that's kind of squarely in the bailiwick of this pod was taking responsibility for the outcomes of your actions. And so what we see in Robodebt is that no one takes responsibility. So the ministers say, no one told me it was illegal, or I didn't go looking because I couldn't change Cabinet's decisions after the fact. There's a whole episode on that somewhere. And by and large, from senior public servants, what we hear is many, many versions of, I am accountable for everything my department, my division, my team does, so I am accountable for Robodebt, but given what I knew then, I wouldn't do anything differently. I can't identify what I did wrong. And I was so busy, you couldn't have expected me to hunt out that information. And then from the junior public servants, what we hear is like, I assume someone up the line had checked it out. I only had this bit. I didn't know that bit. I didn't have the full picture. It wasn't my area of responsibility. So, look, a very unkind take would be to say that the seniors say, I didn't know enough to act, and the juniors say, I didn't have enough power to act.
Yep, I think that's pretty accurate.
Yep. And that's like where the squish of, I think, that SES Band 1, the EL2 is like a real squish point, because they often have both those things. But one of the things we try to do in this pod is to be generous, right? Like we're trying to be generous in hearing what people are saying. And I want to play, it's a longish extract from Finn Pratt's appearance before the Royal Commission. And I just want to play that for you, and then we'll do a bit of reflection.
Commissioner, I don't want to debate with you on this, but not in my world. In my world, there was plenty of controversial media and Senate issues around a whole bunch of things that I looked after. This was one headache which wasn't my headache.
Well, it was enough of your headache for you to sign a letter in response to the Ombudsman's invitation saying the department was satisfied that it was operating in accordance with all legislative requirements and hadn't changed. How could you make an assertion like that without making some inquiry of your own to actually satisfy yourself it was the correct thing to say?
Commissioner, I would sign many, many things on behalf of the department. I have to, as a secretary, be trusting of the advice that my department provide for me. There would be hundreds of letters, significant letters over time, many Commonwealth Ombudsman reports, many Auditor General reports. I am not able to do the job of all of my staff. I would have had over 4,000 people working in DSS during that period. They're all in their area more expert than I am in their area. And so it is not possible to function if you query every single thing. I reiterate, I had over and over again, every bit of advice I saw in that early period in 2017 suggested that we as a department thought everything was working reasonably. Now, obviously, that was wrong, and I was wrong in my assertion to the Ombudsman. I take responsibility for that.
So, the reason I wanted to play that is because I hear here someone who genuinely seems to want to take responsibility. He's not kind of pedantically trying to sort of avoid things. And in fact, he does take responsibility, but he can't quite make it land with what was happening for him in the breadth of his role. And
yeah, I think both things he says are true, and I think that's the challenge. So one of the things he says in even the slightly longer, I kind of got stuck listening to Finn today. I kept going beyond that bit of that grab, and it is true that no leader can be across the minutiae of 4,000 people's work.
Absolutely.
And it is true that a leader should trust the advice that they're being given by their teams. Otherwise, the system really does break down. So that can be true, and it can also be true that you are responsible. The reason you get to those jobs is to be able to pick the ones where you need more, pick risk, look for where... I had a CE ask me about 6 months ago, how do I know if I'm getting good advice? And I thought that was such a cracking question.
Good question.
And so I think both things can be true. And so part of that is about his skills, and part of it's about culture. So part of it goes back to the speaking up culture. So I feel like he actually articulates the actual problem and the big crunch of senior leadership in the public sector, which is you do have to trust your team.
yeah.
How do you make sure they're speaking up, and how do you know when what you're being told isn't correct?
And how do you know which of the many balls you have in the air are plastic and which are glass?
Yep,
Yeah.
right, completely. Oh, that's such a great analogy.
Yeah, got it.
And sometimes you won't know till they hit the ground.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then you're like, oh shit, that was a glass one.
Yeah. Oopsie daisies, never mind. Well, I think, sorry, Danielle, you mentioned culture there. Like, so you've got to be a good risk assessor, which is Danielle's and Alison's juggler, but also you need to have the culture of like people telling you things.
Yeah.
I guess one of the things Darren said to me in the interview really stuck with me about this, so I might just play you that now.
Like, because I do think, though, that, like, I operate on the basis that people are people.
Yeah.
And I want us to operate on that basis, that in every organisation, you're going to have the same mix. We all contain multitudes.
Yes.
We all have the same mix of cowardice and, and when you spill all this onto the table, you see every grade of human being.
Yeah.
It is our responsibility, Caroline, to structure our resources and to structure our organisations to reflect human nature, not to give a happy, clappy corporate seminar about courage and morality
Yeah, so
oh my God, preach.
I know, right? Right.
Completely.
He just nails it. And then also the Irish accent. But so this is the question I want to look at today. So less about culture. We've done lots on culture.
Completely agree.
I want to talk about what are the structures, the systems, the practices that can help ensure that everyone in the organisation has the knowledge, has the understanding to take responsibility at the time. And I guess if I could just riff for a second, like this reminds me of a similar dynamic. So Kate Jenkins, the wonderful sex discrimination commissioner, and she starts by saying, every time I do one of these, someone comes up to me and says, oh, so what do I do if someone comes into my office and discloses sexual assault? And, how should I handle it? And she's like, that's not the question. The question is, so it's not how do we avoid the single incident. The question is, how do we create systems and structures such that that is not what is happening? Like, how do we bake that out? And I just think there's something really powerful about, let's not make this about how do we give people the ability to speak up. Let's make it about how do we have systems where you can't look away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what does Darren say about this?
Well, look, I think the first thing to say is he thinks like that the problem is kind of just baked into the heart of modern bureaucracy. He thinks it's a function of its complexity and its scale, right? So he thinks, in essence, modern bureaucracies fragment knowledge.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right?
Like they industrialise knowledge.
That's right. You've made this point before, haven't you?
I make the tyre, you make the axle.
That's
Danielle makes the windscreen.
That's right. And never the twain.
That's not true, because none of us have any skills.
But to be clear, none of us have any hands-on capability in manufacturing.
I know a guy.
We're looking for leaders if the world comes to an end.
So true. Yes. So we fragment the knowledge, we give it out. And what that does, of course, is it means that institutionally the knowledge is fragmented. Yeah. And so it is hard to have it all in one place. So he has a really interesting framework and taxonomy, which he talks about creating moments of moral accountability. I am not going to go through all of that because it's quite theoretical, and there's some really interesting kind of morality discussion that I found a little bit, it shades into some of the stuff I think that's less for this pod.
Yep.
But here are the sort of three practical, I guess, practice steps that he pulls out. So the first is your organisation does actually have to know what it's doing. It has to have a kind of routinized way of collecting data and information about its impact.
Yep.
Second is
Impact.
Impact.
Not activity.
Ooh, or maybe both.
Just putting a pin in that. Keep
Excellent.
going.
Yep. The second is the information has to get to the hands of the right person, the person who can do something about it.
In a way that is comprehensible to that person.
Yes, that's right, that they understand this is what those words mean. And then the third is, I love this, you need to record keep, because institutions are impermanent and transient, and so you actually need to know what decisions on what information were made, and you need record keeping to kind of do that. So there are his 3 steps. I thought we could talk through them.
Like, again, preach on the record keeping when we get to that. On the first one, though, data. So I guess 2 things here. Do we really think that we don't have all the data we need? Mm-hmm. And the second one is just an observation from some work I'm currently engaged in, which I won't speak too much about, but that I think that sometimes we don't have all the data is used as an excuse to not take action.
Yeah. Look, I think that almost those 2 questions are connected, right?
Yeah.
Like, is it that we don't have the data, or that we don't really have an impetus to collect the data, or maybe put it together in a way that makes sense to us? I mean, Darren's experience in Robodebt was that the facts were just impossible to know from the outside. And then what he said was quite striking in the commission is that he discovers that they were impossible to know from the inside as well.
Yeah.
You know, like he was really struck by Louise McLeod from the Ombudsman's office weeping on the stand as she discovers that 74% of the debts are averaged, right? And as he said, you know, if that fact had been in the public domain in 2017, Robodebt probably would have ended. And similarly, Serena Wilson, the DepSec at DSS, says something really similar. And I want to pause on Serena Wilson because she, I think, is one of the few witnesses who showed a sense of moral accountability in the sense that she shows shame for her failures, right? But she talks about how if she had had the information, it would have made a difference to her ability to act. So I just want to play that now.
The question of how you realised that. Did you at that point say, as a Deputy Secretary, this is unlawful and it is against policy and it needs to stop, to someone?
No, I didn't.
Why not?
I find it hard to explain now.
What's your best effort?
Lack of courage, as I reflect now. My attention, and this sounds shocking, was on a range of other priorities for government. I had no visibility of good data about what was happening. Cases in the AAT at Tier 1 weren't visible to me. Human Services were running and implementing the program, and it was a difficult position to be in. And now I'm ashamed. And in hindsight, I could have spoken up.
So it would have helped to have had the data. Why didn't they have the data? Why didn't they collect it? I mean, I think, they would say how many were averaged wasn't a kind of meaningful category for them when they started the system design. It's hard to get out of the IT system. I think, though, ultimately it wasn't particularly in their interest to collect it, right? That's my view anyway. I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, I think the thing about data and collecting it is what you're going to do with it. So there's no point to it if you're not going to use it.
Yeah.
And so a lot of it is, if we leave aside kind of fires like Robodebt for a minute, a lot of it's about what do you do a report on. So we produce lots of reports in government that are supposed to show how we're going.
Yeah.
Most of them don't show you much at all. Yeah. And some of that is because they're either legacy data collections, and so they're things that we used to count and used to be terribly important and are just not important anymore. A lot of the reporting is statutory. Yeah. And with the greatest of respects to parliamentarians around the country, I'm not sure that when they put you must report on X every year into some of the ledge that they have any operational mindset or any kind of real thought to what kind of transparency is needed. I think that can be really lost in the drafting process and the amendments process.
Yeah.
And so we're not reporting, and I've checked this kind of, I do a lot of looking at annual reports and reports in my current role, and they are not built for looking for flags and patterns.
Yeah.
So they are not built for going, is this agency or division or project or program, are they delivering? Is it having an impact? They're very activity based.
Yes. Yeah.
So there would have been data on numbers of calls at Centrelink. There would have been other data sets. They also don't bring together. So most reporting we do in government doesn't bring together a picture from the outside. It's a picture from the inside.
Yeah.
And so from the outside, you would want to know how many media inquiries about inaccurate debts had gone up, how many AAT cases had gone up and how many had been upheld, how many complaints, what they were last year, this year,
not
this
just
quarter,
from the
last
outside.
quarter.
Like a good leader from the inside should.
Yeah, but it's like the fire danger warning system, right? It's like heat and dryness and wind speed and all of those things that come together in a certain combination.
And so we don't adjust the reporting measures very often.
Yeah.
And so they probably would have, if this had not been a inaccurate, ineffective scandal, they probably would have eventually started reporting on these things.
Yeah, that's
because
true.
we change measures every 5 years, not every 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And so, something's usually around for a long time when it becomes regularised reporting. But on the data part of it, I think the other thing is the reliability. So we have, when we do these big reports, or not big reports, when we do regular reporting, people are very sensitive.
Yes.
So I used to do a report on positions across an agency, and it went to people to have a look at before it was finished. And if there was one FTE that hadn't been updated and moved, it was like, I don't have 9 people, I've got 8 people, and I'm not having that report going out.
Yeah.
And that kind of thing slows it down so much that no one wants to look at things and report on things because we are so sensitive. Now, that has that error had no material impact on a chief executive or a review body looking at where the kind of staff were at and where we were keeping to budget. But people's own defensiveness about their own bit of data. And because it isn't always, it's almost always not 100% correct.
Yeah.
But it's
Never.
often 99 or 95.
Close enough to tell you a trend.
Yeah.
Nope, we have to stop at that point. We're not putting it out because the data's not right. We don't rely on it. We can't rely on it. That's not completely correct. And so I think they're some of the things that really slow us down, and we need to start looking for patterns, not point-in-time numbers of activity.
But also patterns across, various Westminster silos, right? So, I was struck by Darren saying it was really hard to lay your hand on a fact. It's not just that no one in the organisations or outside the organisations had a grasp of all the facts. It's that it took a long, expensive royal commission to even begin to knit together those facts into a coherent story. So I'm not convinced it was a conspiracy to not collect data.
Yeah, me neither.
That they thought would be disadvantageous so much as...
Oh, see, I don't know about conspiracy, but I do think that when you're designing a program, right, so my takeaway from this, by the way, is that when you're designing a program, and that this is like a discipline we should have, you should think not only what do I want to know as the program administrator, but what are my customers going to want to know about this? I think it's it's about good upfront building in of your KPIs and working that out. Not KPIs, sorry, just indicators, working out what that is, and then kind of collecting that rigorously and publishing it no matter what, right? Committing to it. And then if you do that enough, then it loses its kind of political valency because it's no longer scandalous. The first time we published the data about retention of children to year 12, how many kids complete year 12 in education, that was a big story in the first year. But we are in a place now where we have the best reporting in the nation in South Australia on this, and we report it just every year. And now it's just there, right? So if you kind of just routinely collect and report, then it stops being a scandal and it starts being. So that's one thought. But I think there is an impetus to not spending time and effort to collect information that's not useful to you. So knowing how many debts were averaged wasn't actually super useful to DHS, and it was very useful to people criticising DHS. And so there was no impetus for them to work out how to do it and do it well. And even when they did it in a kind of dodgy way, which is how the Ombudsman kind of asks it, they then don't hand it over because they do your thing, Daddy-O, where they say, oh, well, it's not quite accurate. We had to use a few assumptions, so we couldn't possibly give it.
Yeah. Going back to the publishing of it, and there was actually a proactive disclosure.
Yes, proactive disclosure.
So I used to get very frustrated at getting lots of media inquiries that were slightly different but almost the same in a portfolio.
Travel expenses?
No, to do with liquor and gambling.
Yeah.
And each time you'd have to manually recut it for the last 6 weeks or whatever else.
Yes.
And so I was like, let's just put out quarterly data and then just say you're not getting this 6 weeks.
Anything more refined.
Because we're being really open and transparent and we're going to publish it all. So it was actually a whole heap less work.
There you go.
To just proactively disclose it based on a system that you used every time.
Yep.
Instead of having to go back to address that problem of, but it's not quite right and you can't possibly understand it. Yeah, right. Is to just proactively disclose it.
Yep.
And then I think you're well within your rights in a public and a media sense to say, I'm not doing any more than that. We've given you all the numbers and that's as much taxpayer dollar hours as we're prepared to put into it, and we're being really transparent.
Yeah.
And so I think that was a bit of a trend about 10 years ago, and I think Robodebt could be a part of relifting that into being trendy again, which is let's just decide on the metric and the methodology and push it out quarterly, annually, whatever you like.
Yeah.
And let the people do with it what they will.
Yeah. So let's say we've baked out some of that. How do we make sure that the information makes it up to the chain to someone who can actually act on it?
Yeah. So, not only do you need to have someone in the organisation who knows, you then need to have someone who can do something with what you know. And I think here, like, Darren said something that has kind of really reframed my thinking on it. So I'm just going to pop him on now.
It's a matter of risk management. This isn't about telling the minister or grading the minister's preferred policy vision as less than great. Yeah. This is a risk. Risk means action. You have to. Yeah. It's for your. I mean, I can say it's for yourself.
No.
Like,
that's exactly right. Like, because otherwise you're in the Royal Commission doing the thing.
And then you need to have the information needed to make the decision, which we've covered. In the sense, you have to know that the other person is unaware. Yep. You have to know what has happened. You have to be able to push the whole thing up. And fragmented knowledge in the public service is produced by the structure.
So in this grab, what you hear is that Darren suggests one way of kind of mobilising information, of kind of making information move through the structure, is through thinking about it through the lens of risk. And he says that for kind of two quite specific reasons. One is it enlivens the legislative obligations of a secretary to advise their minister about risk or matters of significant impact, as it's framed in the South Australian legislation. But it also relates to the positive legislative duties of ordinary public servants to exercise reasonable care and diligence in your work, right? So you as a public servant aren't being obstreperous or kind of undermining of the government to point out that things are maybe not going as well as they should. You are just fulfilling your obligations of care and diligence in using the language of risk to push it up. I was kind of taken by that as a framing. Don't know about you, but like I thought it was a useful way of kind of unsticking people feeling stuck. And he gives one good example of this, which is that Kristen Lumley, the EL1 in DSS, who commissioned that Clayton Hewitt's advice that went nowhere. And she's in this awful position of sitting on this advice and like, why aren't they acting? What are they doing? And so then there's a media report, another story on the 7:30 report or something. And she sends an email to her boss, right? She's like, I'm extremely concerned that we're sitting on this legal advice. I think you need to make sure that Brenton, the DepSec, is aware of it. It will definitely end up in the federal court, right? So it's that framing of risk, right? Not we're doing the right or the wrong thing. It's like, there is a risk here. There's a risk here. That's what gives her the impetus.
And I do think that is an important part of how we brief up, right, is we talk about risk. But I guess my concern here is the assumption that risk equals action.
Yes.
Because in my observation, that is not always / rarely the case.
Yeah.
I am curious about the role of the Risk and Performance or Audit Committee.
I'd like to do a whole episode on review functions. So there's probably a whole episode on the Ombudsman. But then also, what were the other things that could and should have, like risk, audit, financial management and compliance systems. I think there's actually a whole heap of systems that didn't come up some of them didn't come up in the Royal Commission or didn't come up at all much. And I reckon there's a whole heap there too. I think what's helpful about Darren's thing there, though, is what's the frame we give your squished out EL1s and 2s to raise things. So I take your point that risk, and I think risk gets a bad reputation with senior leaders sometimes, which is we haven't done a really good job of finding those words, a bit like when we've talked about not making the decision based on the advice of risk, which is understanding the risk and continuing regardless.
Yeah, proceeding anyway, acknowledging that you have received the advice about the risk. And choosing to proceed in the context of that risk is completely reasonable.
That's an action, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
And requires good record keeping.
So I think we need to help that squished band in particular find a framework. They've got it, but we haven't really given them a template, and I don't mean a template in a real sense, but to go, I know the framing of how I need to elevate this now. And so risk is one way. I'm not sure it's necessarily the only or the best, but I'm struck by what advice do we give them about what frame they should use to check. Because there are some people who then will go, that's risky, I'm going to tell you not to do it.
Oh, some people, millions of people do that all the time.
Right.
Like, there is a very empowered.
So the problem with that is there are people who are very empowered to say no.
That's risky, yeah.
Or other people who are characterised as bringing to their boss nothing but
problems,
Dead
risks.
mice. Yeah. Here's another little risk I found.
Here's another risk.
Yeah.
In a way that is, I think, depending on the boss, often quite career limiting for those people, and stops the risks being heard in the way that they need to be, in a bit of a kind of boy who cried wolf.
Yeah. So you almost need a system that's quite tolerant, like a structure and a process that's quite tolerant of hearing lots of risks.
Yeah.
And then having kind of documented processes for saying not this, yes, this. Like, you know, we talked in the Pinkbacks one where they just got rid of the work health safety risk, so they never had the conversation about it. Like it's just not on the register anymore. It's so interesting because Kristen Lumley's, her email goes to her assistant secretary, Alison Essex, and she reads the personal risk in the email, right? The email chain says you're sitting on this advice. And so she writes back an email that says, I'm aware of both the legal advice and its contents. I'm also aware of at least 2 external advices which come to a different and opposite conclusion. Square brackets insert from me, unclear what she's referring to because there aren't. But anyway, in formulating further advice, I'm having regard to the inconsistencies between the advices and the differences between the various requests. I am not sitting on the advice, which could have been clarified by further discussion with me. I do not think this will definitely end up in the federal court. So she smacks down the risk raiser.
And before you get to the content of that, can I just point out that the air quotes in her email around sitting on proves that the word sitting on is like a very provocative thing to say to someone.
It is, isn't
because
it?
when she comes back, she says, I am not, air quotes, sitting on. Like bold italics.
Yes, that's right. So Kristen's done the job right of escalating the risk. And what's interesting is when this assistant secretary is asked in the testimony about, well, so why didn't you act on it? And she says again, well, I did act on it. I turned my mind to it. But what she says is, I also turned my mind to the level of the force of the argument that would have been required for the briefing to go forward. I had turned my mind, as I indicated earlier, to questions of authority, and I turned my mind to the best way you could do that to protect my staff in the process. So essentially, she sort of says a version of what Secretary Leon says later, where she says, I couldn't just give the Masterton Prospects advice. I needed the Solicitor General to tell the government that it was wrong. Now, that is an interesting framing because that's like a saying, policy, yes, no, I need a definitive answer. But if we're really thinking about risk, you don't need a definitive answer. You can just say, hey, we've got this advice, we're testing it. There's a risk it turns out we're illegal.
Yeah.
But none of them were willing to do that. They imposed their own threshold conditions about how they escalated it. So I think that's something you also need to say in your organisation is we're happy to flush out risks that in the end turned out not to be risks. You know, that's okay too.
Yeah.
And we can just write down, it turned out it wasn't that. I mean, this used to happen to me all the time. Like every time we'd do an allocation of a particular thing, the team would come to me and say, hey, we've got way too many kids for the particular thing. And I'd be like, oh, well, that's, you know, how are we going to create? And we put in place a plan. And then they come back and say, oh, no, I don't. Every year, did it 3 years in a row, right? And it's fine. Perfectly happy with an early escalation of a risk that turns out to go nowhere. So that's kind of the process I think you need to put in place in your organisation is flag them, have good ways of responding to them, and don't freak out.
Yeah.
Is this toxic positivity in its own special way, right? Like
me or them?
No. But this whole I can't bring the dead mouse in and whatever else, is this some kind of like institutional version of people who, you know, don't say no, don't be sad, always find an upside. Oh, your day, here is the list of things that went off in your day.
Be a problem solver, not a problem bringer.
Right? Like there's this kind of like kind of Anthony Robbins view of the world, which is like every negative word you use impacts your kind of mental health and whatever else, which is fine. But I'm just wondering if we've institutionalised the idea of not saying anything that isn't rosy and...
Well, and so what's really interesting here, and the themes in this episode come up a lot in this book, there's a book, it's a couple of years old now, by Atul Gawande called Checklist, which is about how various hospitals move to taking an aviation type approach to risk and safety. And what that meant is that, so in the hierarchical environment of like an operating theatre, for example, nurses felt that they couldn't speak up and say, actually,
that's the wrong leg.
That's the wrong leg. You've left the scissors in there. I think this person's allergic to whatever. And so they've created this like permissive environment, and it's like printed on people's swipe cards where any person can at any time say stop.
Yeah, right.
Wow.
And I wonder, and obviously that really works for really high risk environments, right? Plane crashes and operating theatres. But is what's wrong here the idea that you need to escalate the risk, right? Because there were people who were aware of the risk, they just weren't empowered to act on it.
Yeah. Well, I think in this case you had to escalate it because it was like overturning a huge cabinet decision. But I think there's something about that, because I didn't want us to do culture, right? But even safety culture or whatever that's, it's called safety culture or something like that.
Yeah.
Even that, like it's the result of a bunch of quite concrete practices.
Yeah.
Like after action reviews, after everything that goes wrong.
Proactive publishing of all the data.
Yes. Yeah. So it's like, what are the kind of things you can put into your organisation that just kind of build our tolerance and ability to live with a bit of bad news, to live with a bit of, you know.
Yeah. And before we get to that final point around the record keeping, I'd just like to say I think it's worthy to consider whether Alison's quite a loss to the aviation industry. and whether despite her expertise in government, whether she's actually found herself in the wrong place, not the right place.
I'm a generalist. I take an interest in any number of things.
Whatever. Her retirement gig is going to be the Chief Executive of Civil Aviation Safety Authority, right?
Giant squid, you name it, I'm in it.
Oh, good Lord. Sorry, team. We'll put a link to the show notes about why the giant squid, but anyway.
It's a great article. Anyway.
Yeah, it is.
You can print that on my tombstone. I've got a great article about.
So to take the steering wheel from Alison, which I would never normally deign to do, that Darren O'Donovan made that final point about record keeping, which I really nerdily have quite a strong interest in and want to make sure that we do not forget.
Okay, I will play it now.
Because it's like everyone's seen something bubble up and gone, oh my God. But when something comes up and gets vested with this authority, and what's really interesting, Caroline, is how little visibility there is to people lower down of what's happened up high.
Yes.
And people have talked, so people have talked privately to me, one of the main things I've heard from public servants who, I speak to is we've just got to get more speak up culture. All right? Where's our speak up culture in our organisation? We're all working on that. But
what about
throughout Robodebt, the word broadly, the word went up.
Yeah.
Because if it wasn't the people internally, it was the media.
Yeah, absolutely.
The damage was fragmentary knowledge where people thought this was before cabinet.
Yeah.
So this had all this work done on it.
Yeah.
Sure, no way. This went up. No way. And that's the danger of inherent authority.
Yeah.
All right. So the idea of you're judging things off of who's touched it, how high it's got.
Yes.
And Robodebt's a warning about the importance of speak down, where knowledge of everything that's happened is shared more broadly. Now, there are powerful incentives against that, where leaking, there's a sort of command and control vibe. I guess from that point of view, when we look at recovering from Robodebt, there is this point where you've got to make your leaders speak down and clearly identify what has occurred. Now, they don't have time to speak down. And this is where absence of records is huge. Because if you're an EL1 and EL2 and you're not being given the original cabinet briefing documents and you're not being given open slather to go investigate the policy you're implementing, red flag.
Yes. Oh my God. So what I love about that is he frames this record-keeping conversation in a really specific context of how do the people who come along afterwards, and let's remember everyone moves all the time, how do they know what the people up top know? And he really thinks about, like, he really made me think about how there is this kind of cloaking thing where you're just like, oh, well, I just assume that the people up top have done a good job and have looked at all the evidence and it's all okay. And actually, as a person up top, that's not always the case. And like, you know, so how do you put that information in the hands of the people working on something? Well, you can get the leaders to go and tell them, but much better solution is to, like, write some stuff down.
Yeah, look, I'm really fascinated by this, and I think this is a macro problem in a lot of ways. So I think the macro part of the problem is that we moved from paper to tech without culture change, training change, and that we have people who entered the service at different points in that transition, all with a different view about its importance and the process and that kind of thing. So, like, this is where the historian nut comes out in me, where if you go back, you used to have a hard copy file for everything. And even with early introduction, when we go to typewriters and then we go to computers, and I have had the great privilege of kind of actually playing in files from, like, the 1800s and then, like, early 1900s, where you have to put gloves on. Some of it for fun and some of it in the interests of an actual piece of advice where we had to go back through something. Because in records, land titles, births, deaths, lots of things, you actually do have to go back to the beginning and pull them through. So you used to have a paper file. They were handwritten, then they were typed, and then they were, when computers were word processors, they were just same as typing. They were just printed out versions. Yeah. You could see the whole history of the issue. The only 2 additional records we had for that was a hard copy diary, for which there was 1 per year.
Yes.
And a notebook. They were the 3 types of records available until not that long ago, like really not that long ago. And there was there was always records acts. So there was always an act that determined what you were supposed to keep, but you didn't have to question what was a record because there was only 3 ways you could do it. Print it out, stick it in the file or handwrite it, a diary or a notebook. That was it. Not very complicated. Yep. Now, I despise paper and love digital, but we have really, I think, made some significant errors, and I don't mean in the last 12 months or under a particular government, I mean over kind of 35, 40 years, in transitioning where we still have the acts and the rules, but they don't use words that particularly newcomers and younger people, so it doesn't say an email is this, a such and such is that. They're still quite global principle-based rules in an environment where, again, I'd say particularly generationally, that will work less well as you work your way through. We also have so many different ways of taking records. So not only is it email and then but some people will use the remarkable, the ones that you can write on. Some people will use notes in their Apple. Some people are on an Android system.
Some people have stopped taking notes altogether because they're worried about the freedom of information.
Look, that's true as well. But even if you are taking them, the question is, like, what is happening to them? And frequently,
is it an official record?
And then there's the issue of everywhere you go is a different system. And so, and that's quite new. And when I say new, I mean I'm talking about in the context of like a couple of 100 years, not new as in this year, but you go to one agency and you need to save it in this type of system using this type of way, but you can't save emails to that one because it's a legacy system. You have to save your emails over here, blah, blah, blah.
I know the agency you're talking about.
But everywhere I've been, it's been the same thing, just in a different kind of different configuration. And then the last bit of that for me is that there's been a reduction of administration. And so as we've moved into a savings environment, and a kind of neoliberal view of how big government should be and what it should be doing, it's a real question of money only goes to people who deliver something directly to the public, which is fine, but that means that the people who used to sit in all the meetings and take the minutes, if you go and look at old minutes, they're like, you think you've raised this before, they're crisp, but they're also all there for a start. Yeah. They're all gone. So there's no one to help you file it, take the minutes, et cetera, and so then you've had a reduction in just the production of records to boot. So I think there's a serious kind of underpinning record-keeping problem here. I think it's a real start-again one. I don't know if it's a real, like, smack another Post-it note idea on top of it.
See, I have a slightly, like, similar but different take on it, which is we create a lot more, air quotes, records now.
Yeah.
But we have lost the art of recording our decisions.
Ooh.
Right? So we have and the Royal Commission's a good example of this, endless fucking emails, diary notes, you name it. Probably shouldn't have sworn there, but whatever.
That's all right. All good. We'll put an E on it.
But what you have lost from those old records, which I've had the privilege of looking through as well, is those really clear, I took this decision based on these inputs and for this reason.
Yeah.
And I observe it even in my time in Cabinet Office in how we write Cabinet recommendations.
Yeah.
I think over the course of the time I have been in the public service, we are losing the art of being really clear about what exactly people are approving and on what basis.
Yeah.
And I think that's the gap.
Yep.
Yes.
I think, can we just add your gap to my gap? Because I think even some of those records you're saying we're producing prodigiously, I'm not sure we're saving them. I'm not sure that in 50 years you'll be able to find my email about such and such that might be valuable in the putting together the pieces of something historically. So
I think, like, I'm going to draw both of your things into a kind of a meta thing, which is so many things. So if we're thinking about the power of record keeping in making sure that anyone working on something has an ability to understand what information has already gone in, what's already been considered, and what is new information that you now need to kind of have a look again, or, you know, blah, blah, blah. Not only, do you need to have the records, they need to be accessible to people. And so, to your point, Alison, like, I think there are millions of records. Like, and now that they've got, you know, our emails are all kind of sucked up into whatever, and it's like a total thing. That's not enough, because the junior officer can't go and search my emails.
No.
Yeah.
Right? So there's something for me.
You'd have to know what you're looking for.
Exactly.
We get this idea of like, oh, but then nothing.
Search it in Outlook, which.
So like nothing's. We got this idea that because it's kind of saved in the cloud, nothing's lost. Well, that's sure, but you got to find it, right?
Yeah.
Which means that I can't find an email that I sent last week in Outlook that's not in the cloud. Using the search term, I know I sent it on Tuesday, and I know I sent it to this person, and whatever else. Like, where is it?
Exactly.
So, what are the chances of finding the right record in amongst so many of them? And again, I still maintain that there's a certain amount of, you know, is it there in the first place?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Well, it's been a fun journey through data and risk and record keeping, but I think that about wraps us up. Till next time.
Just some appropriately bureaucratic disclaimers. Those of us in the employ of the state government speak in a strictly personal capacity, consistent with the Public Sector Code of Ethics that permits public servants to promote an outcome in relation to an issue of public interest, in this case, the betterment of the public service. Nothing we say should be taken as representing the views of the government or our employers. While we've tried to be as thorough in our research as busy full-time jobs and lives allow, we definitely don't guarantee that we've got all the details right. If you want rigorous reporting on Robodebt, we recommend the work of Rick Morton at the Saturday Paper, Chris Naus and Luc Henrique Gomez at The Guardian, Ben Eltham at Crikey, and of course, the Robodebt Royal Commission itself. Please feel free to email us corrections, episode suggestions, or anything else at thewestminstertraditionpod@gmail.com. Thanks to Pampot Audio for our intro and outro music. Till next time.